An ominous warning is coming from the Kremlin as Russian President Vladimir Putin makes his plans for Ukraine clear. Putin says Western nations that allow Kyiv to use longer-range weapons against targets inside Russia would effectively put Ukraine's international partners at war with Moscow. CBC's Chris Reyes is tracking this story for us from New York. Chris, this sounds sort of like a red line from Putin. Tell us more.
Well, it's certainly something that we've heard from President Putin in the past. He's made comments like this before, sort of chest pumping at different stages of this war, Sarah. But is it a red line or is it a bluff or posturing? I mean, that's what Western leaders have to calculate on a regular basis with President Putin in this war. What we can say is that he made a pretty direct statement yesterday about what would happen should Ukraine use those US, UK provided long-range missiles to strike deep into Russia. Have a listen to what he said.
If this decision is made, it will mean nothing other than direct participation of NATO countries, the United States, European countries, in the war in Ukraine. It is their direct participation, and this, of course, significantly changes the very essence of the conflict. This will mean that NATO countries, the United States, European countries, are fighting with Russia.
And Sarah, we of course know that NATO is guided by Article 5 in their charter, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. So this would be the wider war that Western allies have been trying to avoid since Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, those comments from Putin came on the heels of Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to the region. He met with President Zelensky, told reporters that they discussed the use of the long-range missiles, that he would take back what he learned from his Ukrainian counterparts back to President Biden, and that the U.S. has always been open to changing its policy as needs change on the battlefield. So you can hear in those comments that Blinken is keeping it all in the gray zone. We should mention that he avoided the topic altogether when he held a briefing this afternoon at the State Department announcing sanctions against Russia-funded news network RT for spreading disinformation.
Chris, the U.S. President and the British Prime Minister are meeting in Washington to discuss this. So what do we know about that meeting?
We definitely know that Ukraine is on the agenda, Sarah, because we heard the two leaders making formal remarks to each other at a meeting at the White House. That happened this evening. Prime Minister Keir Starmer saying that he's looking forward to talking about their shared concerns over global issues, Ukraine at the top of that list. And, you know, some of the images that you're seeing on the screen right now, that was a pool spray, and that's just industry talk for cameras being allowed in, but really reporters aren't, they're not answering any questions. But President Biden was asked directly. There was one question that got through about his response to Putin's threat of war, and he simply said that he doesn't think much about Putin. What we have heard from a couple of Biden officials today is that there will be no announcement on the change of policy with regards to those long-range missiles. White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby went on the record earlier today saying that the standing U.S. policy, of course, is that those long-range missiles are only to be used within Ukraine to defend themselves against Russia. Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre also said the same thing. And even President Zelensky, who just did a sit-down with CNN, Sarah, has said that he hasn't gotten permission to use the weapons, even as he argued that he wanted to use them for specific targets only within Russia. And he sounded pretty urgent in that interview as he shared his concerns that the longer his allies wait, the harder it will be to stop Putin. Now, even though Canada hasn't supplied Ukraine with long-range missiles, today Prime Minister Justin Trudeau sided with President Zelensky on using them.
Canada fully supports Ukraine using long-range weaponry to prevent and interdict Russia's continued ability to degrade Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and mostly to kill innocent civilians in their unjust war.
And Sarah, that meeting between President Biden and the British Prime Minister happened essentially behind closed doors. So it's hard to imagine that they didn't discuss the use of long-range missiles, but certainly we're not getting any details right now of the outcome.
CBC's Chris Reyes in New York. Thank you. For more now, we're joined by Andrew Rasiulis. He is a fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He's also a retired official with the Canadian Department of National Defence. Reaching him in Ottawa tonight. Andrew, thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome, Sarah.
So let's just start with with the threats being made by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Do you see them as credible?
Yes, because we have to look at the context here. What Putin has said is that these systems, should the approval be given, they require Western, that is American, British, support to fire them. They're not just like tanks. You see, you can give the Ukrainians a German tank or an American tank, and the Ukrainians run it. That's very different from these missile systems, which require continual Western involvement through targeting analysis, data, and firing the whole system. The Ukrainians cannot do it on their own. They could only do this with the support that is hands-on of the Americans, the British, or the French. And so Putin is saying because of that, that constitutes, in effect, a state of war.
Do you think, or what do you think his goal is of, I think, reiterating, because I think we were just hearing from Chris Reyes that he has said this sort of thing before, but repeating this threatening rhetoric, what's the purpose here? He's trying to get them to not do it, I guess.
Yeah, they're certainly trying to get them to not do it. But before, it was all a very low-level stuff about tanks and so on. And they said that if they send Western tanks, the Russians would destroy them. And they, in fact, have been destroying them in the combat. This is different. This now takes Western systems that the West has their hands on. They would be part of pulling the trigger. That's qualitatively very different. And the Russians are not going to tell you or tell the West how they will respond. They will respond keeping in mind their primary objective in all this, and that is to defeat Ukraine, win the war, break Ukraine, and bring Ukraine to the peace talk table and enforce conditions that are favorable to Russian interests. That's what the Russians have their eye focused on. That's what Putin has his eyes focused on. So he's not going to do lateral escalation for the sake of it. He's going to only do what is necessary to ensure, from his point of view, Russian victory against Ukraine.
To what end is this the subject that's on the table between the U.S. president and the U.K. prime minister at their meeting today? Are they? I mean, we heard Joe Biden said he doesn't think much of Vladimir Putin, but I am assuming that this is something they'd be talking about as to whether or not to move forward with this.
Sure. I mean, that's a throwaway line that he said at a press conference. Putin sits on top of a nuclear arsenal that can blow up the world. So that you just don't don't dismiss a person like that. No, the serious part, I think they're behind closed doors. What they're talking about is, A, should the Americans give the British and the French authority to let the Ukrainians use their systems? And then all the involvement that would come thereafter. And two, I think they're also talking about, how do you end this war? Where is this all taking us? Because they are concerned about escalation. They may have bravado at press conferences, but seriously, they're concerned. They don't want to get to where we were in the fall of 2022, when the Russians were not doing very well, and the Russians were talking about a nuclear response to Ukrainians pushing them back to the 91 borders. And there was a lot of talk going on between the Americans and the Russians about how to control the situation. And we've not been there since, because they're offensive right now. The Russians have the momentum. And despite the cursed Russian attacks there, that's being cauterized. So right now, we are nowhere near a Russian situation where they're feeling that they are being existentially threatened, and through existential threat, they would then use nuclear weapons. We're nowhere near that point yet. But it's kind of laying the groundwork. Where are we going? Because the West has to understand, I think they do, that the Russians cannot be defeated strategically, militarily, because they have nuclear weapons. So this is going to have to end in some form of a negotiation, and I think that's where the detailed discussions are taking place.
Yeah, I mean, when we use the word escalate, I think a lot of people watching are very curious as to, we may not be near it, as you say, but what might it look like? I mean, as you say, they're a nuclear power. What's available to Russia in terms of escalating aside from the nuclear weapons?
Well, aside from nuclear weapons, they have a huge conventional arsenal. They have not done, for example, strategic carpet bombing with bear bombers, something like what we saw the United States do during the Vietnam War, and especially the Christmas bombings of 1972, which Nixon did to bring the North Vietnamese to agree to a peace settlement in 73. Now, the Russians haven't gone that far. They have not done a second mobilization. They could do a second mobilization if they were felt that it was getting close to existential threat, short of nuclear weapons. They've got a lot of firepower. They have a huge military. They are only right now fighting with a fraction of their military. But they need to be put in that position where Putin is willing to risk political capital with the Russian people to mobilize them. Again, we're not there yet.
Andrew Rasiulis, a fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and retired official with the Canadian Department of National Defence. Thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.